At first glance, this seems like an ordinary conversation, but what you're witnessing is far more insidious. Many American soldiers, like this one, found themselves agreeing with their Chinese captors. In the Korean War, Chinese forces captured American soldiers. Reports were coming to the American camp that many captured soldiers have sided with the Chinese. In today's video, we explore why some patriotic soldiers during the Korean War sided with their enemies.
Torture won't break them. It only strengthens their resolve. We should think of something else.
What if we could make them choose to agree? I know how. Instead of physical force, the Chinese aimed to reshape these soldiers' beliefs through subtle psychological tactics. As a newly established communist state, China's mission was clear: spread its ideology, no matter the cost. The Korean War began as a struggle for dominance between ideologies. The North, backed by the Soviet Union, sought to spread communism across the peninsula, while the South, supported by the US, aimed to defend democracy. It was a battleground where communism and democracy clashed. And soon, China would enter the fight to further its own ideology. After World War II, the Soviets took control of northern Korea, and the US took the South. Though the goal was reunification, the Soviets set up a communist regime while the United Nations tried to build a democratic state in the South. Amid unrest, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung decided that a Soviet-backed war was the only way to reunite Korea. Determined to unite Korea under communism, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel. The United States responded swiftly, mounting a powerful pushback against North Korean forces. With South Korea's future at stake, American soldiers held firm, forcing the advancing North Korean army to retreat and reassess. China observed its communist allies faltering and prepared to intervene, hoping to turn the tide back in favor of North Korea. Seeing their communist ally pushed back by American forces, China viewed this as a direct threat to its own stability. Determined to protect its interests and the spread of communism in Asia, China made a decisive choice to intervene, seeking to restore balance on the battlefield. Global headlines captured the conflict, with nations watching as Korea became a battleground for ideology. Each report from the front lines hinted at something greater: a war where communism and democracy each fought for survival, and the world held its breath. As the war raged on, soldiers and civilians alike found themselves caught in an unrelenting struggle. Bombs fell, tanks advanced, and every village turned into a battleground. The Korean War was brutal, relentless, and it left a lasting mark on all who lived through it. In the midst of brutal fighting, American soldiers fell into Chinese hands, and with them, the Chinese launched a quieter yet powerful tactic.
Back in American camp, the soldiers came across disturbing news, where Chinese claimed that Americans have sided with them.
Many of your fellow soldiers have realized that communism isn't the enemy. They've seen the flaws in their capitalist upbringing and have embraced the fairness and equality communism offers. The letters we've sent back home are proof of their changed views.
How did patriotic American soldiers end up here, seemingly echoing communist ideals? The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a subtle, calculated process, one step at a time. The Chinese knew they couldn't force American soldiers to embrace communism outright. Instead, they used a more subtle approach, bit by bit, getting the soldiers to make small, voluntary commitments. It was a war of ideas and global dominance where Chinese and US were against each other.
Imagine being trapped in a foreign land, isolated, starved, and broken. Day after day, the Chinese guards treated the American POWs with an eerie calm. No violent beatings, no harsh interrogations, just a quiet, unrelenting pressure. It began with something seemingly harmless. The Chinese would ask the soldiers to write down a simple statement, one they could agree with, like, "The US isn't perfect." In the mind of an exhausted POW, this didn't seem like a betrayal, it was just acknowledging a truth. But this small act was the beginning of something much larger. By agreeing to this, the soldier had taken a tiny step away from his unwavering patriotism. That tiny step opened the door for more requests, each one slightly more challenging to his beliefs. With every concession, the soldier's self-image began to shift, from a staunch defender of the US to someone open to questioning it. The Chinese knew that participation was key. They announced an essay competition, encouraging the POWs to write about their views on capitalism and communism. The prize? Something as small as a pack of cigarettes. Not much, but enough to spark interest among soldiers who had little to occupy their time.
The Chinese didn't seek essays filled with empty praises, but rather those that genuinely acknowledged the merits of communism alongside their love for democracy. These balanced essays were rewarded, as the Chinese knew that voluntary praise was more valuable than forced propaganda. By getting them to articulate these thoughts, the Chinese were slowly altering the soldiers' self-image. They were no longer just defenders of democracy, they had now, however mildly, entertained the idea that communism had some merit. And with each essay, the line between their former convictions and these new ideas blurred a little more. After writing down their thoughts, the soldiers were invited to group discussions. Here, they were encouraged to share their views with others, nothing too controversial, just a friendly debate. But the discussions were carefully orchestrated. The Chinese would subtly steer the conversation, encouraging soldiers to explore their critiques of America, while reinforcing the positive aspects of communism.
Humans are wired to stay consistent with their words. When the soldiers voluntarily wrote essays acknowledging flaws in the US and why communism is good, it reshaped their self-image, even if they didn't realize it. By making small admissions, the soldiers felt compelled to stand by them, and the Chinese knew this. Each small step, first writing, then debating, made it harder to turn back, drawing them further into seeing why communism can be a good choice. What we've seen so far? It's something straight out of the psychology playbook. It's called the foot-in-the-door technique. Picture this. You agree to a small favor, harmless at first. But then, slowly, you find yourself agreeing to more and more. Why? Because we're wired to stay consistent. Once we say yes to something small, we're more likely to say yes again, to something much bigger. The key here is that these commitments were voluntary, active, and public, a trifecta that reshapes our self-image. The Chinese understood this, and they used it masterfully. Small steps, but each one changed how the soldiers viewed themselves. The psychology behind what the Chinese did is known as the foot-in-the-door technique, a term coined by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in 1966. In their study, they found that when people first agreed to a small request, like putting up a modest sign supporting safe driving, they were much more likely to comply with a much larger request later, like installing a big, intrusive billboard on their lawn. But why does this work? The answer lies in human psychology. Friedman and Fraser demonstrated that when people make voluntary, active, and public commitments, it alters their self-perception. Research in social psychology, like Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory from 1956, shows that when our actions and beliefs don't align, it creates discomfort. In this case, once the soldiers had publicly admitted minor flaws in the US, they found it harder to backtrack. For example, the American soldiers began to see themselves as objective thinkers. Once this self-image is established, it becomes easier to ask for further actions, as long as the requests align with that new identity. This isn't just a story from the past. These tactics are alive and well today. Take the example of a car dealership. When a customer comes to buy a car, The salesman's job is to get a yes from you. So, they start with an irresistible offer, something that feels like a steal compared to the competitors. Internally, your resistance to buying starts to crumble. Next, the salesman gives you even more reasons to say yes. He takes you on a test drive, highlights the features, and showcases the interiors that competitors just don't offer. Suddenly, it's not just about the price anymore. Now you've got several reasons in your head that make this car feel like the right choice. By the time the salesman mentions the additional costs, accessories, upgrades, the price has gone back up, maybe even higher than what the competitors were offering. But why did the salesman start with a low price only to increase it later? It's because getting that first yes is the hardest step. Once you're committed, the barriers are broken, and each additional yes becomes easier. At this point, you've already committed to buying it. With so many reasons to say yes, you don't mind spending a bit more. The deal is done, and it all started with that first small commitment. From American soldiers who slowly started believing that communism wasn't so bad, to a customer agreeing to buy that car after being drawn in by a great deal, this shows just how powerful the foot-in-the-door technique can be. But the most important thing to understand is this. When you align your words with your beliefs, this tactic loses its grip. You can't get caught in this trap when your actions consistently reflect your values. Stay true to what you stand for, and the power of this principle becomes ineffective. One of the biggest takeaways from this story is how important it is to align our commitments with our values. Every small yes shapes our self-image.